Hi property entrepreneurs. If you are seriously interested in buy-to-let, then you are going to need to watch this video first, because I'm going to share with you 3 reasons why I believe residential buy-to-let is dead. And if you stay tuned till the end of the video, I'll share with you what I'm doing in property instead. But before we get started, my name's Ranjan Bhattacharya. I've been a property entrepreneur since 1990. This is my channel, and it's dedicated to helping you become a more successful property entrepreneur. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. I release new videos every week, so hit the subscribe button. Also press that bell icon, because you'll receive notifications and be among the first to watch our new videos as they are released. I'm also host of the Baker Street Property Meet. It's London's largest and premier property networking event, where 200 passionate property people come and meet each month. Remember, in property, as with any business, it's not necessarily what you know, but it's who you know. And the best way to connect with property people is at property networking events. So be sure to join us at a Baker Street Property Meet, the monthly networking event. Links and details are available in the description below. So let's get on with it. Here are my 3 reasons why I believe residential buy-to-let is dead in the water. The golden era has well and truly passed. It's finito, guys. But first, let's just clarify what I mean by vanilla buy-to-let. What I mean by vanilla buy-to-let is when you buy a single house or dwelling, perhaps a flat or a small house, and you're letting it out under one tenancy agreement. Or perhaps you've got a small HMO, house in multiple occupation, which you rent out room by room, where you have 4 rooms or less. It's that section of the buy-to-let market, which I think is dead. But remember, these are just my views. I'm interested in what you think. So please, whether you agree or disagree with what I've got to say, leave your comments below. So reason number 1, I think buy-to-let is dead. Well, landlords are out of favour with all political parties. Now, whatever business you're in, it helps if you follow a certain direction of travel, if the wind is in your sails, and more importantly, if the government of the day is supportive of the industry and business that you're in. Whatever business you do, it's a lot harder if you're swimming against the tide and you're doing something which government is not supporting through legislation. And besides, if you're in business, if you're in property, there are a lot more simpler things you can do where the government is supportive and has introduced supportive legislation to help you. Recent governments seem hell-bent on introducing anti-landlord legislation almost on a weekly basis. But why is this the case? In the 1970s, landlords left the private rented sector in their droves. And this was all thanks to anti-landlord legislation and generally lefty government policies, which meant that landlords simply didn't want to play anymore. It was, in fact, the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher in the mid-1980s who made the private rented sector great again. Hang on, did I just quote another property dude? But seriously, Margaret Thatcher in the mid-1980s, she brought in the assured short-hold tenancy agreement. She brought in the Section 13, which gives landlords the right to increase rent annually to current market levels, and also the Section 21 notice, which allowed landlords to get their properties back after the first 6 months of the tenancy. Now, these 3 measures, if you like, gave banks the assurances they required to lend on buy-to-let property as an asset class. And when banks started lending, it meant investors could take advantage of leverage, and the whole buy-to-let industry that we see today really sort of grew up on the back of those landlord-friendly policies introduced in the 1980s. So why is it the Conservatives seem to have turned their back on landlords now? Well, when Margaret Thatcher was in power, she described the UK as a property-owning democracy. Home ownership were at record levels, and government policy was pretty much geared towards home ownership. In the last 30 years or so, the private rented sector has grown dramatically, and it's seen a massive shift in the tenure of property here in the UK. Quite frankly, home ownership has gone down, private renting population has gone up quite a lot. So there are more votes to be had in policies geared around tenants than there are around property owners. Now, this little graphic breaks down the Conservative lead over Labour by tenure type over the last 3 general elections. Now, you can see that the only tenure group where the Conservatives have a clear lead is in properties which are owned outright or properties which are owned with a mortgage. Now, socially rented houses have always had a tendency to vote for left-leaning parties. That's hardly surprising. But what has come as a massive surprise to the powers that be is the Conservative vote among people who live in private rented homes. It has swung massively the other way. Now, when you combine this with the fact of our first past the post electoral system, which means that elections aren't won and lost on a national scale. People in Surrey will always vote one way, people in Liverpool will always vote one way. Elections are won and lost in key marginals. And what's important is what's happening in some of those key marginals. Now, some analysis has shown that in 62 of the most marginal constituencies, the private rented sector now represents 28% of the electorate or more. And that's outstanding, really. I mean, here's just a snapshot of a few constituencies, and it shows, which are marginal, and it shows the Conservative or Labour lead in those constituencies. And on the far right column, it shows the percentage change in the private rented sector over the last 8-9 years. Now, you can see from this that if private rented sector voters are more likely not to vote Tory, you can see how Conservative marginal slight holes will suddenly swing the other way, and Labour marginal holes will suddenly sort of increase in their majority. So that's really why the think tanks of government, if you like, are out there thinking, well, how can we get the private rented sector more on our side, more likely to vote Conservative? And I guess we are the whipping boys in that chase for votes. And that takes us on to reason 2 why I think buy-to-let is dead: the onslaught of more and more regulation on the private rented sector. Now, of course, all business needs regulation, and I don't dispute that, but it's the tone of it all. It seems like there's no such thing as a landlord anymore. All landlords are rogue landlords, and you have to question whether the reason why a lot of the legislation is being introduced is actually going to make any difference to standards in the private rented sector. This ain't going to be a rules and regulations video. I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the rules that are in or are coming in shortly. So you've got mandatory licensing of any property with 4 or more occupants. Of course, there are licensing costs and rules and regulations that apply, and this will affect the viability of some smaller scale HMOs. You've also got councils such as Reading and some more in the Midlands and those sort of areas, and this could grow nationally, where they are trying to introduce separate council tax banding for each room. Band A council tax on each room that you let out. Again, this will affect the viability of certain HMO investments. They're also changing the way you can actually get possession back on a property. So if there are any outstanding repairs that need to be done on a property that have been reported, then you will find it increasingly difficult to get back your property while those repairs are outstanding. There are fears that this can be used or could be used by tenants as a tactical maneuver, if you like, to remain in their property. The new fitness for human habitation rules also give councils the ability to make unlimited fines on landlords. And the fear is that this is just going to be used for revenue raising. In the same way, if you're a minute late on your car parking and you get fined, in the same sort of way, this is just going to be another way that local authorities will raise revenue. But taken together, all these measures are going to mean one thing. The cost of regulatory compliance is going to be more time consuming, and it's going to cost you more, which is going to mean that your yields, your net yield, is going to come down and is going to be squeezed. And more properties will simply not be viable anymore as an investment. But what do you think, folks? Do you think all these new rules and regulations are going to improve standards in the private rented sector? Is there a particular rule that is being introduced which you think is going to have a dramatic effect on the private rented sector, good or bad? Let me know in the comments below. And reason number 3 why I think buy-to-let is dead is the dreaded Section 24. This is the tax on mortgage interest payments and is particularly affects smaller time landlords with, say, 4 or less properties, people who are doing buy-to-let not as a business but as an investment or perhaps a pension or something like that. Those sort of people will need to consider whether buy-to-let is a sensible investment for them. For people that are doing it as a business, those guys are choosing to incorporate or buy their properties under corporate structures, and we have plenty of videos on this site, and I'll share some links in the descriptions below on videos you can watch which can take you, give you some guidance, if you like, on how to incorporate your properties into a limited company structures. I started in property way back in 1990 doing vanilla buy-to-let. Back then, government policy, rules, regulations, etc. were all supportive of encouraging investment in private rented sector, and we rode that wave. The wind was in our sails, we were swimming with the tide, and it was relatively straightforward. The tide has turned. Private rented sector is not sensible as an asset class. So what am I doing instead? Because I'm passionate about property, I love doing all things property. What makes sense today? So here's just some of the areas where I see opportunity. Firstly, commercial property and commercial property buy-to-let. Now, commercial tenants tend to be businesses, and businesses don't have votes. So there's very little political will, if you like, to come up with legislation to change commercial tenancy rules. In fact, the commercial property that we have, much of it is rented out under an Act of Parliament which came up in 1954, which is before I was born, and has remained largely unchanged since then. So commercial buy-to-let, also mixed-use property. I mentioned in last week's video the impact the SDLT surcharge has had on residential properties. 3% extra stamp duty. If you're in the southeast, that can affect the viability of many projects. Mixed-use properties where you have, say, a shop on the bottom with residential flats above, but the whole of the property purchase is treated as commercial as far as stamp duty, and stamp duty on mixed use and commercial property is far lower than residential because there is no surcharge. I'm also passionate and I love the idea of using permitted development rights to convert commercial properties into alternative uses and also to residential use. Permitted development is different from planning permission. Planning permission is uncertain. It can take a variable amount of time and involves sometimes a little bit of luck. Permitted development, or PDR, permitted development right, is a right that you have to develop a property in a certain way. Provided you meet a certain checklist of criteria, you put in a what they call a prior approval notice to the council, and you will be allowed to do that development or conversion after giving the council 56 days notice of your intention to do so. Under permitted development, you can convert space above a shop into a couple of flats. You can convert offices and light industrial units into multiple dwellings. And you can do all of that without having to go through the lengthy and uncertain planning permission process. Now, I've mentioned vanilla buy-to-let, but I am a big fan of what I call multi-unit freeholds. This is where you build or you convert an existing property to form multiple rental units which are basically under one roof. Now, if you have 6 or more rental units in one building, say 6 flats in one building or more, then what you have is the economies of scale to deal with some of the new regulatory compliance issues. And you need that scale in order to make that sort of buy-to-let work. And in the same vein, build to rent and convert to rent, again, 6 or more units in one block gives you some economies of scale to make the cost of regulatory compliance worthwhile. And also short-term accommodation, serviced accommodation and the like, I see as an area where you are making the increasing returns to offset the cost of increasing regulatory compliance. So those are just some of the things that we're doing. We're going to be releasing videos on many of these areas each week. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon so you receive notification on all our new videos, and also come and meet us. 200 of us meet every month at the Baker Street Property Meet. It is London's premier property networking event. Check out the links in the description below for our next event. And whatever you think about what I've said in the video, join the discussion below. Whether you agree or disagree, I want to hear your views. Let's have a little debate. Until next week and next video, happy investing.